Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of It's Okay Not to Be Okay. Today we have an episode which I know may be very personal to a lot of our listeners. In fact, it's something that's quite personal to me too. Our episode is going to be focusing on understanding Alzheimer's disease because it's not just memory loss. I think that I have a lot of questions about Alzheimer's disease because my grandmother herself is a patient. And so Dr. Bhakshani, who is our expert on the show, will be helping us answer the questions that we have. So, Dr. Bhakshani, how are you today?
I am good, Himakshi, and I'm glad we're talking about this very, very important and often misunderstood topic. Misunderstood for several reasons. I don't even think we train enough in it when we go through our training of mental health. It's one chapter in like the whole gamut of what we study. So I'm glad, and I'm glad to be with you.
Thank you. So my first question is Alzheimer's, dementia. I feel like these terms are used quite interchangeably. But is there a difference, Dr. Bhakshani? And can we get an overview on what Alzheimer's disease actually is?
Sure. Brilliant question, because dementia is the umbrella, right? And Alzheimer's is the type of dementia. So I can have dementia of Alzheimer's, I can have dementia of like a vascular dementia, I can have Lewy body dementia, I can have Parkinson's, that's a form of dementia, or I can have frontotemporal lobe dementia, right? So dementia is the umbrella and Alzheimer's is the type of dementia. Now, how are these different? Because they affect different parts of the brain. Because different parts of the brain actually do different functions, right? They perform different functions. So what Alzheimer's affects mostly is memory, behavior, and thinking, right? Like our cognitive function. So that's where those are the three main areas that are affected by Alzheimer's. So for instance, somebody who has frontotemporal may not see that much of a memory loss as much as someone with Alzheimer's, if that makes it clearer.
That makes a lot of sense, and thank you for clarifying that for a lot of our listeners. With Alzheimer's disease, especially in the later stages, and I'm going to be completely transparent here, I've seen this personally with my grandmother, there are implications such as loss of speech. And so I feel like with that, it can be sort of hard to communicate with someone who is put in that position, right? Like with my grandmother, for instance, my conversations with her today are not as well versed as they would have been maybe, let's say, 5 years ago. So keeping that in mind, what would you say are some emotional or psychological struggles people with Alzheimer's go through that aren't always visible to others?
Sure. So pretty much anybody with dementia will, and any kind of dementia, right? So Alzheimer's included, will have aspects of anxiety and depression. So mood disorders are very often seen in people with dementia, again, and Alzheimer's included. In addition to that, and in the broader spectrum of dementia, right? Not only in Alzheimer's, but we can see things like delusions, hallucinations, like in Lewy body, for instance, we see a lot of visual hallucinations. So they see things that don't actually exist, right? So we see some of that. We see a lot of what we call anhedonia, which is a part of depression, which is basically like the lack of desire to do anything, right? They're just there. So that again comes as part of depression. And another thing that we see a lot, and in multiple kinds of dementia, is the agitation, the aggressiveness. So I've had clients who have loved ones. I have one whose husband is actually diagnosed with the FD so the frontal temporal, dementia, and it's very hard because there's a distinct personality change, and that's making him quite aggressive. So aggression, agitation are things that we see also, in addition to the anxiety, the depression, the anhedonia, and of course in severe cases and in some of the dementias we see things like hallucinations and delusions, which so delusions how it's different is hallucinations is that you're actually seeing things or you're hearing things, depending on if you have a visual or auditory hallucination. But with delusions, it's a kind of paranoia, right? So that you're out there to get me. So even with Alzheimer's, you might see, like you were talking about your grandmother, so you might see things like not trusting the people around them or the caretakers. Oh, I need you out of my sight because you're going to hurt me or you're going to do something. So it's those delusions that can be also very, very difficult to manage.
Right. And as you covered, there's a lot, sort of, if we break it down, like as you mentioned, anxiety, hallucinations, fear, agitation. I would love to know more from like a caregiver's perspective. How can we as caregivers really recognize and respond to such emotional needs in someone with Alzheimer's?
So, okay, your starting point, Himakshi, is going to be to consult with a neurologist or somebody who's taking care, right? Because remember, this is the broad spectrum. We don't know what each patient is going through individually. So you want to start with understanding what your grandmother, for instance, is dealing with. But some of the things that I think are important in general for caretakers who are working with people with dementia is patience. Easier said than done. It's really not easy to be patient, and especially if the caregiver is somebody who, like, instance for you, right? Like you have a personal bond with this person. So it's not like a nurse or a caretaker help that we have. So it's harder when you are to be patient when it's a loved one. Okay, but as much as you can as a caretaker, you need to be patient. You need to validate their experiences, right? So now that we're talking about this, and if somebody understands that, okay, they go through this, right? Like they go through these delusions or the paranoia where they're not going to be trustful. So, trying to not internalize it, right? So not making it about you and just understanding that, okay, it's this person's experience, right? It's not that they don't trust me. The fact is this disease makes them not trust anybody. Right? So validating that. Very importantly, not treating them like children, right? So giving them that respect is extremely important, because I've seen in so many cases, like this client of mine who I was talking about, where her husband has dementia. It's almost like you go back to treating them like children, but they're not. And that brings about a lot of agitation in patients with dementia, because they're like, okay, what are you doing? Why are you treating me like that? So you have to be able to respect them. You have to be able to promote as much independence. People with Alzheimer's can actually do a lot of stuff for themselves. So if a lot of agitation might come from the idea that, okay, why are you doing this for me? Because I can do it. Leave. So we have to be able to promote that independence. If they need help, they'll ask for help. At least till they have the language, they're going to be able to ask for help, right? So, fostering that independence in them is very important. And I think one of the most important things for any caretaker is going to be to take care of yourself, to be mindful of your own needs, right? Like okay, at this point, am I losing patience? If I am, I need to walk away. I need to take breaks. I need to kind of share that responsibility with someone, and because otherwise I am going to react in a way that's going to be detrimental to the patient.
Yes, of course. And sort of following on from that, I know the end and latter half of your answer was focusing more on like caregivers. Um, it seems like a lot, right? Taking care of someone with Alzheimer's, putting in that care. And I know you mentioned earlier as well, especially when it's someone who you love a lot and someone you're close to, watching them over the years potentially, not having the same conversations, for example, as earlier, it can take a huge mental toll on someone. So what are some common mental health challenges that are faced by family members or caregivers? And I guess a more important question is like, how can we ensure that caregivers are also taken care of without guilt?
Okay, so let's address the first thing. And commonly what we've seen is things like, again, mood disorders, right? So depression, anxiety, heightened level of stress. You remember our last episode we spoke about stress, and that chronic stress, and what that chronic stress, because obviously your cortisol levels are high all the time, so what that does to you, and then you fall ill yourself, right? So because your immunity is low. So again, these things are common, like anxiety, depression. There's also a concept called anticipatory grief, right? Because that this is a downhill slope, right? So there's no hope. It's not like, oh, it's something, but they're going to get better. No, this is a degenerative kind of disorder. So it's really just going to keep getting worse. So we see people experiencing a lot of grief because this path, and inevitably that this is closer to the end for the patient. But also it's the grief of the loss of the relationship. Like in your case, if you can't speak to your grandmother and she's not the same as she was before, she's there, she's physically there, but it's grieving the loss of that relationship, right? So there's a lot of grief that is experienced by caregivers, especially if those caregivers are loved ones, right? What can you do? I think some of the important things, we've talked about self-care, taking care of yourself, being mindful of what you need, taking those regular breaks, right? So if you can alternate it, or you can enlist some support in trying to take care of the person. That's very important. Making sure that you're taking the time to do activities that you enjoy, right? Because that's important. It's feeding your soul. So whatever that means, but making sure you do that. I've seen a lot of people who are caregivers also kind of become isolated, and partly maybe because of the guilt, because they feel like they can never leave this person, right? Like I have to always be around this person or the patient, but then that's detrimental to you as a caregiver. So making sure that you have your connections and you're maintaining that, you're going out, you're spending time with your social support network is extremely important. Getting professional help, right? So caretakers can reach out to therapists who can be part of that social support that's helping them navigate this really challenging time. And also setting expectations, right? Expectations of self and expectations of the patient. So understanding that nothing you do is going to get them back to how they were, right? So like setting your expectations that this is going to keep getting worse, and all I can do is be there in the moment and do whatever I can for this patient right now, or this person, this loved one right now, while also understanding that this journey can be long, right? So in Alzheimer's, for instance, the patient can live for years. So you can't realistically put your life on a standstill for years. You do need to do things for yourself, and most importantly, because that's the only way you're going to be able to do anything for the person.
Yeah, that's so beautifully conveyed, Dr. Bhakshani. I think once you also learn how to take care of yourself and prioritize your wellness, then you can show up for, your loved one or who you're taking care of in a better way and in a stronger way. So I love the way you phrased that. My final question for today's episode is about really the risks that come along with Alzheimer's disease. If someone in your family, let's say, does have the disease, does that mean that you're at higher risk of the disease? And if that is the case, what are preventative measures we can take to, just make sure that we're overall like healthy or not making ourselves prone to getting it?
Sure. So yes, Alzheimer's has a genetic component, right? And most often it's the early onset. So there's a higher probability. So there's an early onset and there's a late onset Alzheimer's, right? So early onset is when of course you get Alzheimer's when you're younger, and then late onset is after 60, right? So the early onset has a higher genetic link than the late onset. Okay. So, in case of your grandmother, if she only got Alzheimer's after 60, after she was 60, then the genetic factors are there, but it's not as strong, right? And there's other factors, of course. So genes are not the only thing. So there's lifestyle, the diet you eat, getting exercise, and so there was always this thing about, oh my gosh, play games, do puzzles, do all this memory stuff. And what research, in fact, the latest research on dementia is actually saying that one of the most important things is exercise. Being active is one of the most important preventative factors that there is for any sort of dementia, right? So making sure that you are including exercise in your routine is extremely important. Sleep, very important, right? Social support, very important. So these lifestyle things are just as important as genetics, especially when you talk about, the late onset. It's because, that yes, genetics are important, but then so are these lifestyle things. So making sure, and like I said, if there's one thing I could tell you, please start exercising. If you're not exercising, do whatever works for you. Just make sure, because the current research is so heavy on that.
Yes, that is wonderful, Dr. Bakshani, and I think that's something that all our listeners should really take away from this podcast. Firstly, exercise, and definitely get that sleep in. We don't want to be pulling any all-nighters, and we have to prioritize that for our overall health and preventing Alzheimer's disease. So that sort of marks the end of our podcast for today. Thank you so much, Dr. Bakshani, for walking us through more about Alzheimer's disease. And I think one big takeaway I took from this podcast is that Alzheimer's disease, of course, affects our patients, but it also has a toll on the people and caregivers around us. So it's really important that caregivers prioritize their health in order to really help them show up for a better way for whoever they're taking care of. So thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Himakshi, and beautifully put. Thank you. Looking forward to our next adventure.
Absolutely. We'll see you soon on the next episode of It's Okay to Not Be Okay. See you soon.
Bye.